Thank you very much, Skip. It's great to be here. For many years, Skip was a very reliable guide, well, he continues to be, for me through the thickets and tangles and the intricate networks of Arkansas politics that are often quite mysterious to those of us who live on the outside. And I'd say as a general rule, folks who are in politics like to cultivate journalists as if they were growing mushrooms, keep us in the dark and cover us with fertilizer. But Skip has always believed that honesty and good faith can find a way, even in politics and journalism. That's why I'm such an admirer of his. And of course, those of you who know him know he's also a delightful human being. The Clinton School and the Presidential Library has a special place in my heart, as Skip suggested, because my life was one of the many lives that was really changed by the 1992 campaign. When I started that year, I wasn't even a political reporter. I was a new hire at the Washington Post, and one snowy weekend, I think in January of that year, if I remember correctly, I was dispatched to go up to New Hampshire and give the legendary David Broder a few days off from the campaign trail. And I guess the editors liked what I wrote because they kept me on the road for the rest of the year. And by the end of the process, I was forever labeled as a political reporter. Once you get that label, it's hard to get rid of it, unfortunately. I won't bore you with a lot of stories from that long time ago, but it was so long ago that Bill Clinton and Skip Rutherford and I all had dark hair on our heads. But I will mention a day shortly before the Florida primary, which I guess was early March. I was on a bus in Clearwater. Then Governor Clinton was giving a talk to some senior citizens. I guess that's redundant in Clearwater, but and as you might guess, or you know this if you watch TV news, the presidential press corps is a pretty grotty looking bunch of people. So I couldn't help but notice a beautiful young woman with tousled chestnut hair and Jackie O sunglasses near the front of the bus in the seat reserved for the Associated Press. Anyway, that's how Vogue described her that year in an article about women covering the campaign. And I remember that thrilling moment from 1992 every time I see her, my wife, that is. Even before I started covering politics, I was interested in the subject, going all the way back to my 12-year-old summer and the televised Watergate hearings. And the curse of watching so much politics for so many years is that everything new has a way of calling up memories of things that have happened before. The good book says there's nothing new under the sun, which I suppose is ironic if you're reading the Bible on an iPad, but it is true that politics is ultimately about human nature and human conflict and human desire and human ambition and human flaws, and none of those things change very much. And so as I talk about this 2010 off year, which has been dominated by this phenomenon of the Tea Parties, what I really want to talk about is strands running along in the undercurrents that I think have caused this to happen, that are directing what we're seeing and what's going on, and that may actually echo back beyond this year. This very intense and emotional season. To set the backdrop, I'd like to quote a little bit from my colleague Joe Klein, who recently completed a 6,700-mile road trip across the country to take the pulse of the country, meet voters all along the way, and figure out what the mood is. He wrote about his trip last week in Time on the cover, and here's part of what he had to say. Topic A, says Joe, is the growing sense that our best days as a nation are behind us, that our kids won't live as well as we did, and that China is in the driver's seat. This is a popular, perhaps even dominant theme in the U.S. this season, but it doesn't begin to describe the anguish that dominated every conversation about politics that I witnessed during a 4-week trip across the country. With a month to go before a crucial election and campaign ads cluttering the TV, people were in a heightened state of political awareness. I've covered more than a few midterm campaigns, Joe said, but this one seems especially fraught. I talked to dozens of politicians running for office and hundreds of voters. The voters were, with few exceptions, more eloquent and unpredictable and, of course, candid than the politicians. They tended to be extremely frustrated with the national conversation as presented by the news media. They tended to be more anxious than angry, although the infuriated, fist-shaking third of the electorate, the Tea Party cohort, seemed a far more powerful and immediate presence than any of the political parties. I find that to be an awfully good description of the mood that I've encountered as well. There is a strong current of anger, yes, but more importantly, a sense of bewilderment, of loss, and of distrust in our institutions. Now, my undergraduate philosophy training is pretty rusty at this point, but as long as I'm speaking in a university setting, I feel like I should at least attempt a little high-flown thinking. So let me say, what I believe we're seeing here is known in the philosophy racket as a legitimation crisis, which means that for a significant minority of voters, the government and its institutions are no longer seen as capable of making coherent policy. As the public loses confidence in their institutions, the institutions begin to lose legitimacy. And if that goes on long enough, you can have a big problem on your hands. This is how nations fall apart. Now, we're not there yet, thank goodness, but the story of this off-year election, I believe, is a tale of lost legitimacy. It started, I'd say, in Massachusetts when the Democrats there were unable to hold on to the late Senator Ted Kennedy's Senate seat. And then the story grew as one established Republican after another has been blown up in the primaries. The polls indicate that this story of rejected institutions and establishments is going to run right on through Election Day, with the House and possibly even the Senate changing hands. Now, a crisis of legitimacy feeds on itself. It snowballs because the claims of the incumbent office holders or incumbent media representatives, choose your discredited institution, our claims become automatically self-negating. The very fact that someone in an official position is saying them makes them suspect to a large number of voters, because authority itself is no longer authoritative. Insiders really have no defense against insurgencies in this kind of situation, because whatever they say or do, it must be wrong. The problem is with the very insiderness of the insiders. All the tools that are traditionally useful in thwarting outsider candidates, like endorsements and party discipline and editorial board essays and media exposés now become counterproductive because they're all expressions of the institutions that have lost their legitimacy. Now, not long ago, a writer named George Packer wrote an influential, sort of hand-wringing essay in The New Yorker in which he chalked up this whole season of Tea Party activism, of outsider insurgency campaigns, to a kind of dark wave of unreason, irrationality sweeping over the land. He was able to see this from his condo on the Upper West Side. But when I talk to voters about what's actually on their minds, they seem to me, much like the folks Joe Klein met along his way, to be entirely reasonable. Because if you look around, you might see that the authorities have, in fact, screwed up a lot of important things. Just take the past 10 years or so. You'll find a presidential election that ended in a disputed result. We couldn't figure out how to count the votes. You see the missed warnings of the 9/11 attacks. You see faulty intelligence on WMD in Iraq. You see the failed manhunt for Osama bin Laden. You see the collapsed levees in New Orleans. You see the burst housing bubble. You see the oil blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, persistent high unemployment matched with stratospheric public debt. It's not a very impressive record. Again and again through these nerve-jangling years, the system has been tested and the system has failed. Sometimes I feel like we're watching a whole long parade of naked emperors. Now maybe you feel, as many people do, that it's unreasonable to punish the politicians who are in office right now for screw-ups that have been happening over a period of time. But our system doesn't present all that many alternatives. For example, if you try to say, as a voter in a reasonable voice, just to point out what a mess things are, well, the Democratic Party is going to tell you, yeah, but think how much worse they would be without us. And the Republicans will say, yeah, but things would be a lot better if we were just in charge, hoping that you forget that they were in charge and things weren't better. As I say, a certain level of anger and frustration seems completely appropriate. The thing I hear from disheartened Democrats this season is that this isn't fair. If I had a dime for every time one of them has said, where were the Tea Parties when the Republicans were screwing things up? Why weren't they mad then? Well, I could take us all out to dinner at Doe's. But this is where I want to apply a layer of history to the conversation here, because the fact is, these people were mad when the Republicans were running the show. Many of my colleagues seem to have forgotten this, but the elections of 2006 and 2008 were both huge repudiations of Republican governance by the same disgruntled center of the American electorate. The Democrats picked up a total of 52 House seats in those two elections, plus 14 Senate seats and the presidency. So you see, there's nothing new about this voter anger. The voters have been dumping incumbents at a furious pace for a number of years now. I saw a great example of this very phenomenon in the Wall Street Journal this morning. There's a story in there talking about the voters in New Hampshire who recently threw out all their Republicans and now look like they're going to throw out all their Democrats. And the Journal reporter talked to a voter named Gerald Coogan, I think in Portsmouth, and he explained how he why he voted against Representative Charlie Bass in 2006, part of the wave that knocked Representative Bass out of office, and why he is now working to re-elect the exact same Representative Bass. Coogan said, "I wasn't against Charlie. I was pissed at Bush. Now I'm doing everything I can to get Charlie back in Congress." In all those years that I've been watching politics, I can't remember really very many seasons when the voters weren't angry about something. After those Watergate hearings I mentioned, the next midterm, 1974, produced an angry turnout that was hugely favorable for the Democratic Party, and by 1980 those roles had reversed and a Republican wave swept the Democrat out of the White House and washed a dozen Democrats out of the Senate. And so it has continued. I think that the essential political fact of the past 40 years is not the rise of the internet, nor the collapse of mainstream authority. It's the erosion of the political parties as stable governing authorities. Power in American politics now belongs to the group of voters, roughly affiliated voters in the center between the two parties, who feel roughly the same way about both sides. They hate them equally. Consciously or subconsciously, these voters in the middle have come to split power between the two parties because they are never happy with one side or the other for long. Since the 1970s, roughly 2 out of every 3 federal elections have ended up with power divided between the two parties. In some 40 years, neither party has had control of both houses of Congress plus the presidency for more than 3 cycles, and that happened just once in wartime. But what never fails to amaze me is the ability of the political parties to overlook how low they stand in the eyes of these swing voters. I first saw it in that 1992 campaign when the two parties enjoyed so little credibility that Texas billionaire Ross Perot was able to mount the strongest third-party campaign in 80 years in the United States. Democrats emerged from that election in control of the government and somehow were absolutely convinced that the public had given them a mandate for sweeping change. Didn't work out that way. 2 years later, the public dumped the Democrats from power in the so-called Gingrich Revolution, and Newt Gingrich's Republicans immediately made exactly the same mistake. They thought that the public must love them now, and so they forced a government shutdown over the budget. Immediately they started losing ground, and President Clinton was easily reelected in 1996. What we're seeing with the Tea Parties this year, I believe, is an explosive version of this same old story. The elections of 2006 and 2008 were decided by voters who were angry at the ruling Republicans. They threw them out in huge numbers. These were expressions of anti-Republican Party feeling. But in our two-party system, the Democrats reaped the benefits, and they mistakenly concluded once again that the voters were smiling at them. Like Sally Field in her famous Oscar speech, they said to themselves that the public must like us. They really like us. And that's exactly the opposite of the message that swing voters have been trying to send my entire life. For nearly 40 years, they've been trying to tell Washington how unhappy they are. And yet all the Washington parties can hear is, they really like us. Our political leaders are shocked that the public is so easily swayed from one party to the other. In a recent speech to campaign donors just over the weekend, President Obama theorized that Americans must simply be too fearful, given the economic collapse, to think straight. But what I've been hearing from voters these past 3 election cycles is not confusion, but clarity. They understand that the Republicans promised them fiscal responsibility and a sober foreign policy, and then went on a spending spree and started 2 wars without any clear plan for ending either one of them. And they understand that the Democrats promised fiscal responsibility and a moderate policy approach, and they don't believe now that that's what the ruling party has delivered to them. On the Real Clear Politics website this week, I see that the congressional approval rating is hovering around 20%. Given those numbers, I continue to be mystified how either party can believe that they have a mandate from the American people. In poll after poll this season, we've seen the same clear message. Voters have a very low opinion of both parties. But they have only one way to express this feeling, and that's to throw the incumbents out of office. That's bad luck for the Democrats, who happen to be the incumbents this year. And it will be good luck for the Republicans. But if the winners once again fail to learn the lessons of the angry American electorate, those Republicans will not be enjoying their good luck for very long. I'll leave it there, but maybe that provokes some questions or comments or reactions. Bursts of outrage, shaken fists. Yes, sir.
Wait a second. Hold on. Can we get the microphone?
Yes, I've come to the conclusion that given their menu of choices, they will choose divided government. And that, as I say, the pattern going back to the Watergate period, and really, it probably wasn't Watergate, it was the end of the regional alignment of the parties. Once the Democratic Party lost its hold here in the South, and that bloc going all the way back to the Civil War was broken up, the parties became more ideological parties and less regional parties. And ever since then, the pattern has very pronouncedly been for divided government. One-party rule breaks out almost like an accident and is repudiated by the voters almost immediately. Usually in the next election, sometimes it takes 2 elections to break up, and one time, as I say, from 2000 to 2006, the Republicans had control of Congress and the White House, but I think that was purely a result of 9/11 and the wars.
Question, right? Yes, right here. She's coming with a microphone.
Do you think that, assuming the Republicans
Can you
do
turn that up,
turn
please?
the Democrats, what?
Go ahead.
If the Republicans do throw the Democrats out, will it encourage the Democrats to be, will it encourage more incivility?
I love civility. I'm a believer in it, and I'm an optimist. I try to be optimistic, so I'm always hoping for an outbreak of civility, but I don't see why that would happen. For a couple of reasons. One is the electoral strategy that the Republican Party has taken in this session, I think, is going to invite an angry response from the Democrats. There's been, given the enormous numbers that the Democrats had, I understand why the Republicans have pursued this strategy of no, but it's going to leave, I can already tell it's going to leave a lot of sore feelings when everybody comes back in January. But more importantly, I think politicians do what they think is going to resonate well with their supporters. I think that's the way it should be in a democracy. They should pay attention to public opinion. And unfortunately, this is a whole different topic, but as we go through the breaking up and reinvention of our media universe, right now we're in a time where there's a ton of money to be made in the media in fomenting incivility, and not much money to be made on the civility side. So I think that the market forces in the public conversation are going to be in favor of name calling for the foreseeable future.
Yes, we've got a question right here at the back.
Yeah. What are the lessons that they can learn, though? I mean, if a large block is that willing to flip back and forth, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you just going to be satisfied with, deadlock? Just everybody has to move the middle? That's not very much fun.
Well, both parties have tried. I have a good friend in Washington who is a conservative Republican, came up through the Reagan Revolution, really believed all of that sort of thing for a long time in his life, and finally the Republicans got control of the Senate, and then they had the Congress, and so in 2000 I think he was very excited that suddenly a lot of these fiscal ideas and economic philosophies of classic economic conservatism were going to be attempted. And I remember a disillusioned conversation I had with him about 2 years later when he said, David, I finally figured out how Washington works. He said, whoever wants to spend the most wins. And if you look at the real root of the Tea Party concern, at least as it's expressed, and Tea Partyism is hard to talk about because it's not a top-down movement, it's not well organized, there is no platform, there's no convention, there's no nominee, so it means many things to many different people in many places. But the thread that you hear across the board is a sense that America's escalating public debt is at some point going to become unsustainable. And so it seems to me that a party that tried genuinely to address that issue might be able to appeal to the center for a sustained time. I'm not sure of that because while people hate spending, they like their checks. They usually hate spending for the other person. But it's worth a try, given the extent to which I do think it is consistently on the public mind.
Got a question?
At what part of this do you think the media has played in this? As soon as one person wins, it seems that the media is going to go after their bad characteristics or something. I don't care that someone with an only child spent $2 million on a wedding. I don't care that somebody in East Jesus, Texas has $1 million ranch. They worked hard for it. It is their right to do it. But it seems like this is not going to stop until the media starts reporting facts and what is really important, and besides a lot of stuff, because everybody may like trash and going back and forth, but I don't see anything. But I do see the media not attacking the Tea Party as much as they do the Democrats and Republicans, because they are the grassroots. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I don't think well, I agree. It's the first thing that makes that question tricky is that the media doesn't really mean anything anymore. When I was a kid, there were 3 television networks, and my hometown had 2 newspapers, and there was a local unaffiliated station, and I guess there was radio. There was some radio networks, but that was, there was the Associated Press. That was the media. You could pretty much, make a list, and it wouldn't take you long to figure out what that is. Now they're very influential media outlets that are just one person with a blog, or that's neither good nor bad, right nor wrong. It just is. It's what the online revolution has wrought, and there's no undoing it. But what it means is that, if I can get really boring about the economics of media, if you've got just a few, let's take television networks, that's easy. If you've got 3 choices on television, that means that each of them is trying to get at least a third of the American people to watch and listen to them, and really they'd like to have probably half the American people. The audiences for Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley, and back in the 60s and 70s, were tens of millions of people every night. If you're trying to appeal to all those people, the way you do it is by presenting a viewpoint that's somewhere, between the 30-yard lines. And people would argue about whether Walter Cronkite was skewed too much, a little to the left, or this other, a little to the right. But basically, they were trying to appeal to everybody. So you could watch that news show, and you might get ticked off a little bit, but you would feel like it was reasonably fair. Now, if you take that and you blow it up into how many channels do you have on your cable? 200, 300, 500. But you immediately lose all the people who don't care about politics. They're watching the sewing channel, or the food channel, or the gardening channel, or the football channel, or the fishing channel, or the wrestling channel. They're gone. And now you've just got the people who care about politics, and it's a much smaller group, but they've got strong feelings, and you can make a lot of money not with 20 million anymore, or 50 million. Now you can make a ton of money on 1 million or 2 million viewers. MSNBC's primetime ratings are about 1 million people for Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow. Over on Fox, for Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, it's 2 to 3 million people. These are tiny audiences that would have gotten you canceled off CBS in a heartbeat back in the 70s. But the way you speak to that audience is to appeal to things they already believe, to tell them that the bad guys are still bad guys, that the good guys are the good guys. It's a whole different approach to the story, and as long as that is the case, those voices are going to be heard, and they're going to be loud. I do think, though, that over time, in a way, we've only gone back to what the world was like before the invention of television. when you would have not one newspaper in a town like Little Rock, you would have had maybe 4 or 5 or 6 newspapers. And there would have been the conservative newspaper and the liberal newspaper, the Democrat newspaper, the Republican newspaper, the poor people's newspaper, the country club newspaper, and they all would have had their own voices. And readers in those days, I think, had gradually developed a more sophisticated, in a sense, approach to the news. They figured out where each voice was coming from. They learned to discount a little bit. You know, oh, well, yeah, I saw that story, but it was in the, you know, the Daily Crier, and we all know about the Daily Crier, so I'll take that with a grain of salt. I think the American public, we're still sort of in the process of re-educating ourselves of how to live in that kind of a world where you have to not only gather information but figure out how to evaluate it as well. It's an ugly process while it's going on. Sorry to go on so long about it.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
And think about what you were saying. I was wondering if you would agree with this comment that in reality, what the Tea Party movement is a splinter of the conservative or the right-wing conservative of the Republican Party. And is this not a dilemma for the right? In reality, there may be disenfranchised people in the middle, and there always have been. But when you cite 92, was that the Reform Party? I can't remember what they were calling it at the time with Ross Perot. But that the anger wasn't the same as what we're witnessing now. And so, like, for instance, I don't see how people on the left, or even marginally on the left of center, are going to respond to some of the venom and even some of just the very conservative issues that these people seem to be in favor of. So, I mean, you know, is this really something that more the Republicans are going to have to deal with rather than the Democrats?
That's a good question, and I have a couple of thoughts about it. The first is that it's actually a lot like 92. Right down to the guys dressing up in 3-cornered hats and knee breeches and for their rallies. This idea of an unaligned movement that is deeply in touch with, you know, core American values, that recurs over and over again, and is very much a strain of what's going on in the Tea Parties. The media element that I just was talking about, it's such length, is relevant here too, because the Tea Party that I see on television is not the Tea Party that I see when I go out and cover the events. I may be going to the wrong events, but I think there is in some parts of the media an attempt to make the Tea Party look a lot angrier and more dangerous and scary than it really is. You know, there are, if I just want to go point out the whack jobs at a political rally, you can do that pretty much any political rally. But yes, the first article I wrote about the Tea Party, you know, I did end by saying that anybody in the establishment, including Republicans, needed to be very nervous, very afraid about this movement. And as we've seen it play out so far, it's the established Republicans who are paying the highest price. A guy like Bob Bennett in Utah, you know, who certainly looked like a lifelong senator to all of us up until about 10 months ago, wound up finishing third in the Utah Republican Convention, didn't even get into a runoff to be renominated for the Senate. Charlie Crist in Florida. The Republican governor of Florida has been driven out of the party. In Colorado, Jane Norton, the establishment candidate for governor, was knocked off by a complete unknown in the Republican Party. So they're the ones paying the price so far. I do think a lot of these Tea Party related candidates are going to be elected in November, and how that affects life for the Democratic Party, we'll see. I think, I mean that sincerely, I can't predict. The striking thing to me is that, you know, the Republican Party was really in a bad way, you know, in January of 2009. They'd been thrown out of office. They'd lost over 50 seats in 2 years. They'd lost the presidency. They'd lost the Congress. They had no clear party leader. Their nominee for president was not well liked by the base of the party. So they were in a difficult position. They had a hard time, you know, saying who they were, what they were about, if you remember. And then this wave of energy has come up from the right, as you say, but that fundamental problem hasn't really been solved. The wave of energy has not yet produced, you know, clear new party standard bearer. There's no Ronald Reagan so far coming up out of this. There may be eventually. But so they're going to, if they take control of Congress in a few weeks, they're going to come in with a lot of these same problems, still these same issues not resolved. And they're going to have a lot of work to do to figure out what's their agenda, what do they do now, how do they work with a Democratic president, and so on.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank David Von Drehle.